Hello, and welcome to the Chain Mountain Podcast. I'm your host, Hank Ackerman. In today's episode, we talk with Lauren Calhoun, a director of an aortic operations group at Medtronic. For those of you living under a rock, Medtronic is a $33 billion global healthcare technology company, and they develop and manufacture medical devices and therapies to treat a wide range of chronic diseases and conditions. In our conversation, Lauren and I discuss the evolving landscape of healthcare and the significance of quality control in medical devices, and the potential of personalized medicine driven by AI. We also discussed the challenges in AI implementation within large organizations, and particularly in the healthcare sector. And she emphasizes the importance of understanding ROI, effective change management, and the need for better forecasting tools. Lauren also shares insights from her career journey, highlighting the importance of networking and learning from various functions within an organization. Enjoy. All right, Lauren, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. We're going to dive right in, and it relates to a conversation that you and I had a little bit earlier, but there was a report I recently saw released by MIT's NANDA initiative, right, that reveals that only 5% of AI pilot programs achieve kind of the rapid revenue acceleration and the P&L impact that they had thought. And so the vast majority, obviously the remaining 95%, right, are still delivering little to no measurable impact on companies' P&Ls. There's a couple things that are cited. Kind of the lead author, Aditya Chalapalli, cites the core issue being learning gap from both the tools and the organizations, right? And the other item is that more than half of the generative AI budgets are devoted to those sales and marketing tools. And contrary to that, right, MIT found that the biggest ROI was really in back office automation and elimination of business process outsourcing, cutting external agency costs, streamlining operations, right? So first question to you, you have implemented systems in large, complex organizations, and I would consider Medtronic a large, complex organization. I'm sure as you would agree. Does this sound familiar, right?
Certainly. I would say I recognize both aspects of that. So just both that I think sometimes we are a little bit rosy in our understanding of ROI and also probably underestimate the implementation expectations that we should have when it comes to deploying a complex system. So I think we see both sides of that equation as well.
Yeah. And when they don't live up to that ROI, right, do you think it's primarily a poor implementation, or do you think it's over-optimistic ROI assumptions that are baked in for people, trying to win the capital for the project?
I think those two things actually go hand in hand from the perspective of I think we expect that the payback comes more quickly because our implementation will be flawless, right? I mean, not exactly flawless, but I think it'll go exactly to the plan. And honestly, I think we invest a lot in our implementation planning. Like I think we have great change management teams that spend a lot of time, really trying to plan those efforts out. However, I think one of the things that comes with automation in particular is that kind of teaching element or that transition element of what's the knowledge that's been like on paper that is often I think really accessible to try to put into automation, and what's the knowledge that like lives within the team members that have been executing the job and the way that they've been doing it in a particular tactics and things that they've been deploying in their day-to-day that just tribal knowledge that you haven't captured. And I think those are the kinds of things that are really hard to anticipate when it comes to an implementation plan. And then again, when that slows down or you run into challenges there, that impacts your ROI, right? And so I think it comes, both sides of that equation, I think, are impacted in that situation.
Yeah. What are the kind of the tools or tricks that you use to, kind of correct for that, right? And I know, you've been both a project manager, so you've had great, experience in that regard, as well as in the systems knowledge. And now you kind of obviously have the functional expertise. How do you kind of account for that when you're planning out and setting expectations for your implementations?
I think based on a unique experience I've had in my career, I did have the opportunity to work as a program manager on a software development effort. And I think that gave me an appreciation for the importance of like requirements development upfront and a clear understanding of what those are. I think from a mitigation standpoint, it's having, I think, really clear conversations about what have been the stumbling blocks or the lessons from other efforts like this in the past, and particularly in the recent past, right? Because I do think we have learning cycles around each one of these implementations, and we get better and better at
Right.
this. But I think it is making sure that we do kind of check our assumptions because we're eager to get that payback. We're eager to move on to the next thing. I mean, the technology, I think in general, a company like Medtronic, most of the people who are working with these change management activities have a technical background, and there's kind of a natural excitement to kind of move into a new phase of technology. I think there's the mitigation is kind of like, can you look at information from past implementation and really just fact check a little bit? What can we learn? What can we build into our planning based on our last experience?
Yeah, yeah. Now, I think it's important for the audience probably knows all of this, but in reality, there is the concept of return on investment, right? And the assumption that if something has a good return on investment, it's going to get, the company's going to go ahead with it. And I think if you've been around the cycle long enough, you understand that really different parts of the organization are competing for capital, right? There's a capital pool at the end of the day. Yes, you have to have an ROI hurdle, but at the end of the day, you've got to make a compelling case, right? And so, times people probably stretch the ROI assumptions and maybe make something seem a little bit sweeter than it is. I mean, given that statistic about how much the half of the budget AI budgets are being allocated towards one part of the business, I mean, how are you making a compelling argument to say, operations, we need more of that AI budget, right? We're the ones who are able to recognize this ROI, and we have compelling help me make the compelling case for why more budget needs to be funneled to supply chain and operations, basically.
I think one of the aspects of ROI too is there are certain kind of areas of an ROI calculation that are more, I think, tangible and reliably, I guess, estimated. And there are other factors that are a little bit more nebulous to try to put figures around.
Right.
And those sometimes makes those areas easier to poke holes in, right? So I think one of those areas, for instance, has been it may make an easier argument to say we want to create a digital twin in our product development lifecycle or our capital development lifecycle. We're going to invest in a large piece of equipment. We want to make a digital twin of what it looks like for that piece of equipment to fail over time, right? Or what it would look like for it to operate and fail.
Right.
It may be harder to articulate what would it look like to have a digital twin of a supply chain or a value stream, and what are all the ways that you could quantify the benefit of that based on the many different things that can break down, because they don't break down like a widget, like a metal
Right.
widget that's going to have a certain failure rate that's predictable, and so on and so forth. So
Right.
I think our ability in operations to, I think, quantify those things and describe those things and be better storytellers to a certain degree about what those things are when there's not as precise of a quantification in telling that ROI story is important to get those investments. I think that's a big aspect of that.
Got it. Got it. So, obviously you've been successful in telling this story, kind of without any giving away any secrets, right? Is there anything, any like new technology that you're using or you're applying that you think is really neat and noteworthy, that you can, kind of tell the audience about?
I would say, I wouldn't say it's specific to me or my team, but Medtronic has recently undergone a big transformation around our forecasting tools. You would have
Yeah.
seen in years past that potentially site to site or operating unit to operating unit, split out by what kind of therapy our product supports. We could have used different forecasting tools to plan demand for product, supply for product. We've now deployed across Medtronic an enterprise-wide tool that helps with that and make sure that we're all speaking the same language, looking at the same data sets. I think that's been, both impactful but also challenging in its own right to get everybody on the same page. Some of those lessons around, what have been the planning practices that have been, documented practices versus techniques
Right.
used by planners is reflected in that as well.
Yeah.
Um,
Can you share what tool that is that you've from demand forecasting that you
we
deployed?
we've moved into Blue Yonder
Okay. Okay.
as our forecasting tool. Yep, and
Okay.
that may not be something that's like new and novel, because I'm sure there are other industries or companies that may have been using that for a period of time. But for us to move, I think, out of the different preferences of all the different stakeholder groups that were in Medtronic, um, I think is significant to get to an enterprise solution. Maybe just this little bit of context.
Right.
Medtronic at this point is effectively, in my time, Medtronic within 13 years had doubled in size as a function of the acquisition of Covidien, if we go back a
Right.
handful of years.
Right.
And underneath both Medtronic and Covidien as legacy companies, there are a number of acquisitions tucked into each of those companies, or legacy Medtronic, legacy Covidien businesses.
Right. Right.
And with that, you inherit each of those systems and practices and so on and so forth, kind of ways of doing business. So to get everybody, into a harmonized system is pretty impressive.
Oh.
To begin with, but
It's a never-ending job, really. I mean, yeah, and the forecasting as being a component of that is always certainly a challenge, right? In terms of getting your segmentations right, and the obviously the data that goes behind it, but also a consistent forecasting process and in cadence, right?
right.
Now, is the Blue Yonder tool, does it have an AI component to it? And just as context, right? There's typically two kind of AI applications. There's AI that actually helps with managing the selection of the heuristic and actually with the actual math of the forecast. And then there's AI that you can put on top of a data set that allows you to query the data set easier, right? Is Blue Yonder is your implementation using any AI in that?
I've certainly seen more of one than the other, but my understanding is we have the capability for both. So we've certainly deployed the first, where we are now assessing through that forecasting tool what are the better heuristics for things like demand that's following a certain statistical pattern. And Medtronic is a global company, and so you
Right.
can think of seasonality, but in
Oh, yeah.
different regions of the globe, or
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
are the patterns of when different kinds of products are used based on, when might different disease prevalence for different medical conditions shift throughout the year, right? So
Right.
how can
Right.
heuristics kind of help us with that demand prediction? As well as, though, we've started, I think, more to look at the latter of how can we then interrogate that database for things like scenario planning or modeling different situations from a supply standpoint as well.
Right, right. And one of the capabilities of obviously AI forecasting, and not necessarily agentic AI, but AI forecasting, is the ability to bring in and understand the correlations of different pieces of data, for instance, weather or housing starts, and that probably doesn't apply to Medtronic, right? But other pieces of information. Is that on the roadmap to be able to kind of integrate those more forward-looking outside forecasts and pull those in?
Maybe you can help me understand the question a little more.
So there are AI forecasting tools right now which are looking at external data sets. So say weather information is probably as good of an example as there is, right? So a weather forecast globally, and then it's bringing that in and testing that weather information to say, is this a good correlator fundamentally with the performance of your historical forecast. And if it is, right, it effectively pulls it into the heuristic to be able to say there's this external forecast, just like a customer forecast, right, that I may be pulling in to be able to help me, educate or train my historically backwards looking heuristic. There's some complexities that's associated with that, right? So, number one, I have to have a reliable forecasting data set. And a lot of that comes in the form of governmental, forecasts, those types of things. Has to be, a consistent format. And there's AI tools that are even being used to clean up the forecast, when it comes in and kind of make it consumable by the machine learning model, right? Then that is, then obviously used and interpreted by the forecast to be able to say this is worthwhile, this is not, and how can that improve our forecast accuracy over time, right?
I'm not personally aware that Blue Yonder does that, or if it does,
Okay.
that we have started to use that or consider it yet. One of the things that I think is interesting about working in the medical device field is also I could certainly envision applications of that, particularly when it comes to like healthcare data, how that might be very useful to us in such modeling.
Right,
But
right.
also the fact that access to that is very regulated in certain parts of the world, that certainly varies. So
Yeah.
in some markets, I think it's something we could potentially access and incorporate in theory. In other parts of the world, it is not. But I'm not aware that we do that now. We do have, I think, something that came up as a later point of your question about Medtronic or kind of future applications. We do have a program where we are partnering with certain hospital systems when it comes to inventory management, and I could
Ah,
certainly
yeah.
envision
Okay.
a point in the future where that data sharing becomes part of what we can all leverage in this ecosystem around planning and AI.
Absolutely. You know, I unfortunately I could say I've been around supply chain enough to see the prevalence of CPFR, basically collaborative planning and forecasting, right? With our between a supplier and a buyer come and go, right? There's times in which it's like, this is my data, I'm not going to tell you about it. And then there's times when it's like, okay, we need to share data because it makes us more efficient, right? And I'm always a little bit surprised at how long this has taken to really be a prevalent practice within supply chain, right? And you look at the retail world and the forecasts say that Amazon or Target and those kinds of companies give their suppliers, they're weighted because say they know I get a certain allocation, so I'm going to over forecast so that you give me the allocation that I need, right? So it becomes kind of a game, so to
Right.
speak, right?
A little bit of like
Um,
prisoner's dilemma. No.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it's exactly prisoner's dilemma. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a real world application of it, right? So, um, you know, talk to me maybe a little bit more about that concept and where you see that going, and then are there hurdles that you've run into already with it, or is this just kind of a roadmap item for Medtronic?
I'm aware of maybe two passes at this, and I have kind of limited familiarity with the current because I think it's somewhat of a new program. So we have had a prior, again, small scope effort in Europe where we were looking at applying some lean concepts that we had developed within Medtronic and how we deploy that more in the manufacturing environment with partnerships with hospitals. And part of that was also the ability to manage, for instance, like a catheter lab and
Right.
use some of those same concepts of how you flow um, inventory or flow patient through treatment, kind of in a similar concept to how you might flow product in manufacturing environment.
Yeah.
Part of
Yeah.
that though was also, collaboration to manage inventory, right? So we've
Right.
done
Right.
that. We ended that pilot program. I think we took some of the learnings for that, and that may be applied into what we're doing now. It's a larger scale program referred to as our name here, just real quick reference. Supply chain control tower program.
Okay.
So it's hospitals deploying their own staff, technology, analytics, the hospital supply chain. However, they can, uh, you know, connect with Medtronic on this for support.
Right.
And I would anticipate that this is, again, like we would collaborate with our suppliers in effectively, how do we coordinate our forecasts for raw materials to suppliers and rely on them to support us and kind of who's holding what amounts of inventory to hit a certain reliability target. I would
Right.
imagine it's the same type of a concept, but for us with a hospital system that has, a certain volume of patients for particular treatment areas, and being able to coordinate with us to make sure that we're meeting their, contractual requirements for supplying them with product that they need.
Yeah. So it's, kind of, if you think of it, point of sale measurement, if you will, right? Being able to say, how many of these are being consumed, or demand sensing in a way of that, more, executional horizon, how many of these are being done, what's our inventory level, and then setting, safety stocks and cycle stocks off of that to be able to generate a replenishment signal, right? No, that's great to hear. That's good. And so, I mean, you know, to that end, right? I think one of the challenges as a consumer of healthcare in the U.S., right? At least in the U.S. that I see is obviously the changing landscape of how our insurance is managed, and those types of things are obviously a big deal for us. It's not the same, obviously, in all of the parts of the world that Medtronic manages. What's the impact on your job, right? In terms of kind of the shifting sands of how the U.S. in particular, right, is thinking about healthcare and obviously Obamacare had a big impact, and now the rollback of some of the Medicare benefits. Just talk to me a little bit about what that's demanded of the supply chain.
We've certainly seen different approaches, I would say, come and go, particularly as far as like emphasis on or kind of say maybe proposals more so around the concept of maybe you know reimbursement for an outcome or reimbursement for an entire treatment versus at the product level in some instances. And
Hmm.
so this can vary between the US and other geographies, just as an
Hmm.
example.
Okay.
Um, that can certainly influence our thinking around, again, like how do we, think of our product on a continuum of care? How do we think about supplying product on that continuum of care?
Hmm.
Um, it, it, it starts to impact, again, what are the types of treatments that are occurring at different levels of hospital systems, specialty centers that have higher volumes of certain types of cases, what are going to be instead maybe smaller volumes at less specialized centers less frequently. It depends a lot on the different types of treatment or the medical condition that's being supported. Um, Again, I come back to that concept of, when we have those larger centers, the opportunities for more coordination of how we're managing inventory certainly comes up as an opportunity. And like, is there more of a predictable rate of, servicing those customers and providing for those customers
Right.
rather than, kind of piecemeal throughout the course of a quarter or a year. Um, Another, I guess, aspect that comes to mind for me, and maybe it's not so much the I guess strictly as a function of like healthcare and insurance landscape, but just generally being cost efficient. I mean, that is a function of insurance, but just across the
Right.
board,
Yeah.
cost efficiencies. In the medical device space in particular, that's leading to a lot of merger and acquisition activity.
Hmm.
That's a function of technology development, but also cost. Particularly in our supply chain, we're seeing a lot of instances where we might have multiple suppliers of similar components that are acquiring one another. And so our supply
Hmm.
base in some instances contracts. In other places, we're seeing divestments. And so that means our supply base expands. And so that has to keeps us on our toes as far as contracts we have with our supply base. We also, though, in terms of the acquisitions that we make of other companies, be that to acquire a technology that's in development, so it could be early stage like R&D work, or it could be a product that's nearly commercialized. It could be a product that's maybe in clinical trial and about to commercialize, or has maybe some commercialized product in another country. Um, Part of what happens there is we inherit the supply chain that may be underway for that company. And so that's
Right.
also a dynamic situation for us in, again, how do we adopt that supply chain or that value stream into the Medtronic footprint, or deliberately decide not to do that and transition to a more, I guess, Medtronic familiar supply chain. So that's certainly a dynamic piece that impacts our supply chain as well. That's somewhat of a function of the healthcare landscape overall.
Right. That's really interesting. Are there ever instances where, you will adopt one of those, or you'll acquire or see one of those supply chains come in, and you're kind of like, ooh, I really like the way that they do, that thing in particular. I'd like to adopt this internally ourselves. Or is it more Medtronic imposes its will, on its acquisitions?
We certainly have to meet the same bar for things like quality and regulatory requirements, so those are non-negotiables.
Right.
But when it comes to the detail of a particular maybe supplier and how they're supporting, an acquired company, or maybe manufacturing processes and how those are being executed within an acquired company, we certainly learn a lot from companies that we've acquired. I think
Right.
one of the challenges, though, is typically, it seems more often than not in my experience, Medtronic intends to scale a product, or scale with that company, and that can put a lot of stress on a supply chain, certainly. And so,
Yeah.
it's great when we have come into instances where the supply base that's working with the acquired company can keep up with that and is ready to grow.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
wonderful. But in
Good
some
for them.
instances, that has not been the case. So yeah.
I can imagine. There's times when I think supply chain has ruined me, right? And I use an example of standing in line at TSA, right? And you see the inefficiency, and you're just like, oh my gosh, I want to. So I have to kind of bite my tongue. Um, are there things that you and Medtronic do where you say, you know what, the world could really learn a lot from what we're doing, right? From this particular process that we've implemented, and is there anything kind of you see where you know on a day to day basis, there's inefficiency in the way things are conducted versus the way that you guys at Medtronic conduct your day to day lives.
I think perhaps in the medical device industry more holistically than specifically just Medtronic.
Right.
Again, I mentioned that regulatory quality bar is a non-negotiable.
Hmm.
I think for folks that haven't worked around maybe medical device, automotive, aerospace, because I think we see employees that have moved
Yeah.
across those
Yeah.
industries at times. Just the level of focus on quality and building quality into the product rather than like
Mm. Hmm.
inspecting for it.
Right.
Um, the the level of control that we like to maintain in our supply chain, so not only in like our manufacturing processes but out to suppliers, and the raw materials coming into suppliers, maybe even farther back into our supply chain in order to achieve the quality that we need from our products. um, I think it would be something that's interesting to folks that just had not worked in those industries at all,
Right.
and what that means for the robustness of our supply chain. I think there's a learning in that for people that haven't had exposure to that industry before. It's kind of eye opening. I think when people have come from outside of those regulated industries into Medtronic or into medical device in general,
Yeah.
and been quite surprised by just again level of control, level of specificity that we put on components out to our supply chain.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and certainly you brought good parallels in terms of automotive and aerospace, right? Quality has a different mentality to it, I think. Where and maybe for the listeners, use it, break down that example of um, quality, not inspecting for quality, right, but building it into the. Can you just give us an example of what that means?
Right. For instance, I would say, let's think of like, in an earlier time at Medtronic, I was a packaging engineer. And so maybe this will be relatable. One of the things that we have to think about is our product being distributed through all parts of the world, right? I have a
Right.
funny story
Yeah.
about a team member who worked with me who, part of kind of going on a Gemba, he happened to have family in India. So while he was home, he took a day and watched some of our product be, moved from a distribution center to a hospital, like on a moped. And it was like, oh, great example of like, these are the distribution conditions our product might see, right? Um, so we have to think about things like, shock, vibration, weather conditions on our product and making sure that our product remains, safe, functional, sterile through those conditions. So we talk about kind of designing with quality from the start. In packaging, one of my roles would have been to design a corrugated box, the
Right.
shipping box that holds multiple product inside of it. And we would have been talking about things like the fluting of the cardboard, the
Right.
thickness of the cardboard,
Right.
the spacing around, like how much room does the product have to move so that it's not going to, you know, crunch. It has a little bit of absorption, but it's also not going to have too much play to move within the box. How's it going to fit on pallets so you're not worried that somebody's going to like cargo strap something that they're not supposed to. You're thinking of all these different things that could happen to your product along the supply chain. um, and anticipating those things, and those are all things that get put into your specifications at the start to really control. Like a supplier can't swap in more recycled content that can change the nature of the corrugated boxes that you're using and surprise you that that box is going to behave differently when it's out in the wild.
Right.
So it's
Right.
things like that you're thinking of at the design phase of your product
Yeah.
from the onset, right? So that's what I mean by you're designing that from the start. You're not kind of waiting until you're farther in the process or in manufacturing to be looking for quality checks
Right.
to find these things.
That's really interesting. I work with a lot of clients in manufacturing where you see the lack of that process being executed up front, right? And you see a lot of problems later on in a product launch or something like that. We realize that this is there's this problem, there's that issue, et cetera. And that's a really interesting point. For some reason, I had a visual of kind of like Daniel Craig on a motorcycle, kind of driving through traffic, in Mumbai to try to, get your Medtronic part to the hospital on time, right?
It
Um,
happens. It happens.
so you've had a very interesting, and so packaging engineer, I saw was kind of how you got your start at Medtronic. But before that, I thought you had a really interesting path into getting into supply chain, right? It's funny, all of us, I think, who have been around a while, and not suggesting that you've been around nearly as long as me, but I, you didn't, supply chain wasn't something where you said, when I was in my 20s, I said, oh, I want to go into supply chain, right? You kind of happened into it. Tell us a little bit about how you got into it and ultimately landed at Medtronic.
Certainly. So I started my career actually in the Air Force. I had completed ROTC when I was in college, and so I commissioned as an officer in the Air Force directly after I graduated from the University of Texas. I spent about 6 years in the Air Force. The first three, I was working in the aircraft maintenance field where I led aircraft maintenance organizations. So at one point, that was like the shop that, would you'd take parts off of the aircraft, take them back to the shop and fix them. Everything from like landing gear to ejection seats to,
Yeah.
big engine components. So
Yeah.
it was an interesting role. And then I worked on the flight line for a period of time, working with like an aircraft maintenance unit that supported a particular aircraft. And then for the next 3 years, I transitioned into a role that would now technically be in what's called the Space Force today.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh, neat.
yeah. So, but at the time, it was still the Air Force. And so I was based in Los Angeles
Yeah.
and I worked on a satellite software program. And so that's where I learned a little bit more about like the process of, setting software requirements, managing a large defense contract on how we work with contractors to meet those requirements and software development in general, just at a pretty high level. And then I decided to make the transition out of the Air Force. Maybe just a little bit of context in my family. My mother was a medical lab technologist working in hospitals,
Hmm.
and my dad had an academic background in genetics and evolution. He taught for a while at a
Oh, neat.
university. I have a memory of being a little kid and going to like a intro undergraduate class where he would play that country song "I'm My Own Grandpa," and he'd have students do the pedigree stuff. And so I don't, like life sciences was always in the background for me.
Yeah, that's
Um,
cool.
and I certainly knew when I was leaving the Air Force that was an interest of mine, kind of as the next phase of my career, was to get
Right.
closer to something that was still mission driven, something that would impact the lives of people through healthcare in general.
Right.
I wanted to
Right.
move into that, and I recognize my background, both academically and through work, had more of a operations logistics bent to it at that point in time, and it was certainly
Right.
interesting. Right, those are
Yeah.
big, complex problems to go after, and never a dull moment. So that was where my interests
That
were.
that's true. Well, thank you for your service, number one. Number two, what was the coolest experience you ever had in the Air Force and or to be Space Force, I'll call it.
Um, hmm. I I was able to go to some interesting places. Technically, there was a
Okay.
time when I was living in Japan and I
Okay.
deployed back to Alaska, and so that was kind of a
Okay.
funky, like I'm from the
Yeah.
U.S. living in Japan, and my deployment was back to Alaska. Um, that was no, it was just interesting because of the work that we were doing at the time, but it was
Yeah.
also like the coldest I have ever been in my entire life as a native Texan. It was just like not a fan of being there. Um, but it was also good, from a supply chain perspective. I had
Yeah.
done some work around recommending some changes to how we would manage our deployment kit. So when you're thinking of things like moving an aircraft, you're going to move the tooling, the spare parts, and so on and stuff that come with that. I had made some recommendations on what we would do to kind of set a new standard for that type of aircraft, not only for like our group, but also that could be used, across Air Force units.
Right.
And so
Right.
that was a little bit of an opportunity to test that out and try, if we use that footprint, could we be successful and validate that we could use that going forward? And so it was a good learning of, got to implement an idea as a young 20 something and see if that was the right way to go. And so that was a good experience as well from that perspective.
That is amazing. What can you tell what aircraft you worked on, or was it top secret?
Oh no, it wasn't. No. So I worked with KC-135 aircraft that were
Okay.
refueling aircraft, and
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
particularly the group that I was with in Japan had not only the refueling mission, which is critical, right? Nobody gets anywhere without gas,
Absolutely. Yeah.
um, but also we had a aerovac medical mission as well. So that meant that in a lot of instances where you have military service members around the Pacific, or their family members who might need specialized medical care that's not available local to where they are, our aircraft could be used as one that would go pick up patients and move them to other more specialized hospitals, either back in the US or other parts of the Pacific. And so that was really a critical mission that was great to support as well.
Yeah. That's a really really cool experience. And now, um, so I kind of broadly lump personal advancement into two alternating phases, right? You're learning a craft and then you're honing a craft. Um, any particular periods that stand out of each of those, and what a young aspiring executive like yourself would should stand out to them?
For me, I would say my background, you might be able to sense this. Like, I think I have a skill set as a generalist. I haven't really dove deeply into one particular area of operations or supply chain necessarily. Um, but I will say one of the things that I have focused on as such had been really making sure that I connected with and networked with stakeholders in those different functional areas um, before I needed those relationships or connections, which I'd say is a really critical
Yeah.
thing. Like learning about those before they become
Right.
critical in a crisis.
Mm.
So I would say that was part of the skill building aspect of that. I I really loved during my time in the Air Force that one of the things that my mentors or leaders there encouraged, particularly when I was working on aircraft, was like, you need to be where the work is happening, and that's how you're going to learn the most, right? So I actually spent time, taking the floorboards out of an aircraft one time, like disassembling, the aircraft as part of a maintenance overhaul. That's how you learn how the systems work, is you're actually,
Yeah.
with tools taking the aircraft apart. Um, Spending
Yeah.
time with, the folks that work on the aircraft. But I also think that applies like in an office environment as well, like,
Yeah.
investing time and going to talk to somebody in finance about like, how does money move through this organization? How do projects get
Yeah.
funded? How do things get paid for? When it comes to operations, again, you can never spend too much time, because like, this is where your revenue is coming from. How is your product made? Look left, look right. Where are the components coming from? How does that flow in? Where does the product go? How does it get to
Yeah.
distribution? How does it get to your customers? I think particularly when you're junior in your career, like that's when you have as much of the time as you're going to get to do those things. That's when you can ask all of the questions, and they don't seem silly at all. People are really, I mean, I've never come across a situation where somebody's bothered to answer questions. Maybe it's a culture thing at Medtronic. Everybody's open to support you, but also, particularly when I was junior, it's like, great, they're excited to talk about their work and they're happy to
Yeah.
answer all those questions. So I think really being deliberate about that was helpful to me in kind of getting that broad perspective, because later you are expected to be able to connect those dots, right? So that kind of
Right.
honing part of things is when you hear about a problem in one area or one site or with one supplier, the ability to connect the dots to, okay, oh, I've talked to somebody in a different function that has mentioned a similar challenge, and this may not be exactly a match, but like it's worth another conversation, and I can ring a bell for me, right? That's really important as you move along in an organization.
Yeah. That's a tremendous observation. I've likened, supply chain sometimes to like the gray matter in an organization, right? It may not be the frontal lobe or the hippocampus or anything in particular, but it helps connect all these parts of the business. Um, you know, Talk to me a little bit about, the importance that that's played in your career. You did kind of mention, hey, I've took the time to learn about, a little bit about finance, a little bit about, procurement, a little bit about all these different things. But maybe talk to me about, kind of the importance that that's played, but also the importance of then the managing up part, right? And I think as a, again, as an inspiring executive, there's no, seldom is there any classroom where you're going to sit down and they're going to be like, all right, here's what it takes, to get to the next rung. But there's instances where you clearly need, when you're stuck in the middle management role, right? You clearly need to be able to, understand the greater mission, and be able to communicate that back down to your team, but also vice versa, right? What does my team need to be successful, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. I remember at times when I was like more junior in my career, this almost like perception of like, oh, there's like the man behind the curtain that like they must know more and they must have the better answer and they must, and I think as you progress, you realize like, no, that's some of the
There's no,
information that
yeah,
like, even, junior
yeah,
contributors, I'm meant to
yeah,
bring that expertise, and I'm meant to advise and bring my
yeah,
skills to the table and help those leaders with some of these decisions, right? Like,
yeah,
there's no one person that has all the answers and is going to be right all the time and just knows how it all should run.
right,
Um,
right,
so, I guess ditching that perspective has helped a lot. um, but I would agree. Like I think it comes to up management. One, I think that aspect of kind of understanding the connections across that I think comes with a little bit of that deliberate investment. It comes with a little bit of time in your field. Some of that's naturally going to happen as you work more cross functionally in your organization. Um, I think is certainly important because again, when you're I guess leading up and you're working with more senior leaders, they are inherently going to have more of, I think, an enterprise perspective on problems and making decisions. They're going to move more away from that particular functional silo of concerns, right? So your operations leader certainly like has a lot of information about that area, most focused on that area, unique accountability for that area, but they're not only solving problems for that function anymore, right? They are
Right.
solving problems for their business unit or maybe even the enterprise, level. So I think maybe having that perspective is important. Appreciating that, when you're, I think one of the things I used to love when I was like younger was really keying in on the types of questions. Like every opportunity you're interacting with an executive is an opportunity to hear those questions and try to understand more about where they're coming from, what's at the root of the question, what's the type of information that that leader needs to help make decisions. What are they really listening for to understand? In some instances, they're trying to kind of guide you a little bit to help you with your problem solving, but also for them to make their decisions, is there kind of a pattern to what they're seeking from you, anticipating that to bring it to the table. But also, I think that gives you a good indicator of, what's expected of you when you're moving into those greater leadership roles. Like, how are you meant to consider things from that enterprise perspective? And I think also understand that, like, you may have wonderful ideas. You may have, data to support exactly what you want to do. Um, Being told no sometimes isn't a personal thing. It's not the worst outcome. I think the more you can connect your solution to other, not only the problem that you're solving, but are there other problems across the organization, is more likely to get you to a yes. But sometimes,
Yeah. Yeah.
frankly, you may have problem number 20 on the list of things and 15 of those can be funded, and that's not
Yeah.
a ding on you. It's the scheme of things in the organization. And I think being able to see that though and understand, you know, maybe after the fact, or learn more about, hey, how did that settle out, or why did that settle out that way, is just a great learning opportunity.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? That and I bump into this a lot, especially in the, kind of sales and operations planning world, where you have to kind of sell the project to, four or five different parts of the business. And you have to say, hey, you're going to get benefit from this, but you got to put something into it as well, right? And there's kind of a sales work that needs to go into that. And if you can get everybody on the same page and show that value, then it's a much more impactful ROI. Very interesting, and good observation. So any stories from your past on what not to do, right? Any spectacular fails, or instances where you can say, what do we call them, back in the day? You call them CLMs, career limiting moves, right?
I mean, I guess I have one that's kind of personal. I don't know if it's like totally supply chain related.
Right.
I guess it would be, don't lose a flare on an aircraft, like a refueling aircraft. It's not exactly what had happened, but it was a good lesson in communication, I would say. So it was just an incident where, one of the things that we do is we inventory certain kits on the aircraft,
Right.
and
Yeah.
for a brief period of time, somebody had misplaced or miscounted the number of flares, and this is on an aircraft that is fully loaded with fuel for aerial refueling, which means a lot of aircraft
Yeah.
fuel. And so we go through our sequence of kind of tier meetings like you would in operations. We had the
Right.
same concept. Um, and I think my day started probably like 6 a.m. at the time. So my 6 a.m. tier meeting starts, and that's one of the first things that's covered. And what's told to me is like, we lost the flare, such and such happened, but we found it and it's good. And I think at that point in time, I just did not ask enough questions about the kind of, okay, but you know, maybe the five whys. What happened? How do we make sure it's not
Yeah.
going to happen again? Let's make sure we get all the
Yeah.
learnings, because that could have been certainly a very serious incident. And I think been able to better communicate the learnings from that, so that when I
Right.
took it to the next level, it was a tighter story as to it's resolved and here's what we've learned. Um, that got away from me a little bit. And so I think it's a little bit of a rough day, but ultimately the incident in itself was contained.
Yeah.
I think a good learning for me from that, though, and as I think about that today in the context of, again, the role I'm in today, we certainly have these tiered escalation processes. We certainly,
Right.
execute these in operations all over the place. Um, is again being really crisp in the communication, just in the scheme of things in operations, I just think of it as like you need 1,000 things to go right every day to have a great day, and just
Yeah.
rarely does
Yeah.
that happen flawlessly. Um, just being very clear on, what are the things that need to be escalated for action, and what's the urgency, what's the time frame for that to happen. Versus, I think in this case, this was one that was more of it's good to communicate it as here's something that happened for us that we would like everybody else to be aware of, because it could be a learning
Yeah.
for you. Not something we need a response to, or not something we need help with. Um, as had kind of maybe happened outside of the meetings when it wasn't as clear what had happened. So yeah,
The importance of inventory accuracy, right?
totally.
At
Yeah,
its
that's there.
most high level. That's
Yeah,
awesome. Oh,
yeah.
great. Um, okay, second to last segment. Can you provide listeners and your future self, right? A prediction about the future, a few predictions about the future, right? You can make it, kind of a economic, tech, industry specific, whatever you want to, right? Just have fun with it, right? Any predictions you might have about the future?
I think one of the things that's interesting for me to think about, I mean, the products that I personally work with are at this point relatively mature, as in they're kind of standard of care products, and they're relatively mechanical, right? So we don't have a lot of the ones that I work with don't have a lot of electronic aspects. They don't have a lot of like drug or genetic aspects to them.
Right,
So I'm really fascinated by the concept of like personalized medicine, kind of where that space is going.
right,
I think with AI, I think with AI is one option, but also, just other tools and technologies out there, we're going to learn so much more about the body, ourselves, our health. I mean, it's rapidly changing right now. I just can't
yeah,
even imagine what that's going to look like in 10 years, 20 years. And then the ability to use that data when it comes to health management. So the
right,
concept of, what can you intervene with that's, lifestyle? What can you intervene
right,
with that's drug? And then when it comes to like a product, if, when you need a medical device product, what exactly do you need that might be different to what exactly I need? One of the limitations of clinical trials in general is just, again, you have to study on a certain very controlled set of conditions on a certain patient population, and then a product goes into the wild, and you certainly adapt and iterate from there. I just think if we had very precise information about very precise patients, and the ability to, pass that information back in a useful way, thinking back to things like the quality that we need for a product, the regulatory requirements we have for a product.
right,
How could you make a single medical device for Lauren that meets Lauren's needs, backed by, the data we have on our products, but also with the unique information about Lauren's medical
oh,
history?
yeah,
Um, there are some areas where I know we're already doing that, but in the context of the products that I work with, it'll be really fascinating to see how that comes together. So I'm excited about that. I guess
yeah,
technology more broadly. Um, I don't know. I think I'm interested in some of these predictions about where AI will replace certain roles or not others. Um, I think that's still maybe relatively near future. I'm not totally convinced in a lot of instances where I think I hear that, such and such role can be replaced. I think there's a lot of really powerful analytical tools. And again, I described kind of connecting dots when it comes
yeah,
to, persuasion or making an
yeah,
argument for something that you want to invest in. That is powerful, but I also feel like there's a lot lacking in terms of context and soft skills and EQ and things that I think are still very much needed around those.
right,
Um,
right.
so I could eat crow. I could be proven very wrong here, like, maybe in the near future, that those tools become more powerful and adaptable to those aspects as well. But that's something I'm interested in. Is just, again, what does it look like to, you know for those to maybe mature in that sense, and if those predictions could pan out. I'm skeptical, but
Yeah, you're not immediately worried for your job, right? But
yeah, not
don't.
particular. Yeah, I have a friend, for instance, that works in like a legal research field, and she had commented about, you know some folks using AI and this concern of like still getting answers that are a little bit hallucinated. And
Yeah.
so it still helps to have a human researcher that, that's not exactly the case law, that it's not exactly what it said, or that's not the right case. So like, so,
Right. Right.
we're not going to be replaced right away. So,
Yeah, yeah. But I will. I had another guest, previously who talked a little bit about how they use AI to kind of summarize contracts and extract, pieces of information out of a contract. And so some of those are long, 30-page legal documents, and to be able to, kind of get little key pieces of information and nuggets out of it is very valuable. But to go in my mind, the more interesting part of your answer or your prediction was that first part, right? The personalized medicine. And, I look at that and I'm we're all on a journey, at least I'm on a journey to try to, be healthier. And now, I realize I gotta, I got limited time. And so I need to take care of myself and brain health and physical. And there's so much that in science we've learned about, how the gut biome and your brain and, your cardiovascular system all interact. Your point about personalized fitness or personalized medicine really is really, really, relevant. Right. And I mean, to the extent that, certain chemicals, certain foods, certain things do something to one person that may not be, the same impact on another person. And, I think, where AI can help there is be able to, consume, consolidate, and kind of make meaningful observations around people, where I think today you basically have to have a doctor who's going to run a lot of tests on you, and then come up with a personalized diagnosis, right? How can you kind of create that personalized experience in a mass market? My wife and I went through a period of watching that one show, the Royal Pains, right? And the doctor, Hank, who I share a name with just accidentally. I wasn't named after him. He wasn't named after me. We always used to laugh because the first thing he would do is he'd be like, I want a CT scan and a 10-panel blood, blood test, right? So everything was kind of the same diagnosis, but it was. I think there's a lot to that, right? I think that's a very, very powerful prediction. How long do you think before that becomes commonplace?
I think there are a lot of building blocks that are there now. To some elements that are not far off. I think some of the pieces that I could envision, though, when I'm thinking of our specific products, though, that would be really fascinating would be, for instance, um, let's say I can advise on medical management of a heart condition, but in the farther along in that journey, could an AI tool recommend, for instance, very specific specifications around the stent that you need for your coronary arteries, and properties of how that stent needs to behave and move in the body, and so on and so
Yeah.
forth, such that it would say, okay, well, you usually build it with such and such wire and such parameters on the stent product itself. I'm going to recommend this instead, and like a prescription for a product itself when you get to that stage in disease management, right?
Wow. Wow.
It's almost like maybe like Internet of Things kind of
Right. Okay.
tie in
Yeah.
there. Um,
Yeah.
and I don't think that's terribly far off either. I think it's kind of
No.
regulatory pieces, and how we kind of manage
Yeah. I
data.
mean, material science, right? Additive
Right.
manufacturing, ability to be able to, gather the specs for something and then turn it around and manufacture it and get it, to where it needs to be quickly, right?
Right.
That's really interesting. All right. So, last question. I'm borrowing a page out of the one of my favorite podcasts, the Diary of a CEO. And there's a prior guest who will leave you a question. You don't, they don't know anything about you, right? So they've left this, kind of blindly. And, I'm going to ask you to obviously leave a question for the next guest. But I am going to pull it up here and we're going to see. what you have, what you were lucky enough to get. Okay. What invisible rule do you often break that you think more people should break?
I'm thinking about it.
It's a tough one. Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
tough. It can be a tough one.
I mean, I think I don't know. I don't know if this would be a rule so much, but like one of the important things to me, and I think a learning for me, just as I've advanced in operations, has been I think I would have felt more before, like you have these KPIs to hit, and they're very black and white as far as like you live or die by the KPI. And I'm sure maybe my performance valuations would still do that. But just as far as how I think I operate in the day to day and encourage my team to problem solve through things, I think there's so much more gray to navigate and trade offs to think about because I think if you operate that way, you make really stupid decisions sometimes. I've seen,
Yeah.
for instance, somebody trying to hit a raw material inventory target. Oh, we're not going to place any more POs for this component, and we're not going to bother to tell the manufacturing team that we've done that. And if we go line down, we're not measured on the production. We're
I
measured
hit my
on
KPI. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm measured on this
Yeah.
KPI over here.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I've lived through some really big challenges created by kind of black and white thinking around metrics, and so there, especially in the operations world, there's so much
Yeah.
emphasis on KPIs. There's so much emphasis on I'm either pass fail, red green based on this, and I'm not. I personally, I can't be wired that way anymore because I've just seen too many things that have gone wrong as
Yeah.
a function of that thinking. Um, so I've kind of ditched that mentality. I've I've encouraged my team to also really move away from it and think more about, again, how does this one play off this one, this, and this other one to really think more critically about trade-offs.
Yeah. Wow. That's a great, that's a very good response. I think that's really interesting and food for thought. And certainly, yeah, I agree. In the operations world, a lot of conflicting KPIs, right? So, Lauren, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Incredible insights. And look forward to talking again sometime soon.
Thank you. Thank you
Thanks.
again.